Hey there! Welcome back to another King Kong review. This time it's the two mightiest monsters of all time. The Battle of the Titanic Titans. King Kong versus Godzilla. Now, I actually did watch it on this shitty Hollywood movie greats VHS because the picture quality on this tape is horrible. I'm just keeping it for collector's purposes. I actually saw it on a multi-pack DVD that was sent to me by a good friend of mine named Mike. And, yeah, I had heard about the film for many years. I just never really got around to seeing it until recently. And overall, I thought it was alright. It was an okay movie. It wasn't like it was anything amazing or spectacular. A little bit disappointing considering you have King Kong and Godzilla in one movie, and their battle, their tussle, really doesn't leave a lot of impact, if any, at least for me personally. It was fun, but it wasn't particularly memorable, and the ending definitely sucked, in my opinion. The version I saw was not the Japanese version, which I heard is completely different than the American version, and I've also heard things like it's better. I don't know for sure because I haven't seen that version, and I think I'll wait on seeing that if I ever do get around to reviewing Godzilla movies. But I have a lot of Godzilla movies I have to get my hands on before I can get to something like that. But anyway, yeah, I don't have much experience when it comes to comparing this with other Godzilla movies because the only Godzilla films I really am familiar with is the original, the first one, the 1998 remake, Godzilla 2000, Godzilla 1985, and Godzilla vs. the Smog Monster. Because those are, and then this one. Those are the only Godzilla films I've actually seen all the way through. Other ones I've heard of and I've seen clips of, but I haven't seen them all the way through. Oh, and of course the 2014 Godzilla remake. Yeah, goddamn Zilla. How could I forget that fucking thing? Well, yeah, I can forget it because it ultimately is really forgettable. But anyway, this is a film directed by Ishirō Honda. It's written by Shinichi Suzukawa. And the version I watched is the American version, which it was an English language version of the film. So John Beck ended up enlisting some other writers, Paul Mason and Bruce Howard, to write a new screenplay for the film. And then he had some other guy direct some footage for the movie. I'm trying to look at your Beck sold to King Kong, blah 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 blah. We got he worked with editor Peter Zinner to remove scenes, recut others, change the sequence of several events. He hired Mason and Howard in order to give the film more of an American feel. And the new footage was directed by Thomas Montgomery and shot in 3 days. And this new footage was just, in my opinion, really pointless and shitty footage that was just boring, and I honestly didn't care for. It was like it was just force-feeding information to the audience in the most dry, boring way imaginable. So the new footage was shot footage of stage and television actor Michael Keith playing newscaster Eric Carter. A UN reporter spends much of the time commenting on the action from the UN headquarters via an international communications satellite broadcast. And Harry Holcombe is Dr. Arnold Johnson, who's just spewing all of this fucking garbage, all of this fucking babble. I was trying scientific mumbo-jumbo explanations about what Godzilla is, or what King Kong is, or how they're big. I don't give a fuck. I don't give a shit about any of it. Arnold Johnson needs to go work for Johnson & Johnson's or something and get the fuck out of this movie because I really hated this character. He's the head of a museum of natural history in New York, and he tries to explain Godzilla's origin and Kong's motivations to no avail whatsoever. Cannot do that. Well, he tries to, but he fails. And the movie stars Tadao Takashima, Haruo Nakajima, Kenji Sahara, Yu Fukiji, Ichirō Arishima. I'm probably saying all of these names wrong, and I apologize. Mie Hama and Sorochi Hirose. Features music by Akira Ukufube. The American version, though, features a different score, which just sounds like stock music, and that's exactly what it is. So it's not really that impressive. Cinematography by Hajime Kozumi. It's edited by Riko Kaneko. And it came out in 1962 and it did pretty well in Japan and did okay in the US. Now, the American version, of course, is heavily altered with different scenes and different cuts. I don't know what cuts are done in this, but it is pretty obvious that these scenes are out of order. And then you also, of course, have your typical bad American dubbing, and some of it is really, really cringy, like really bad. But at the same time, it kind of adds to the entertainment factor of the movie for me because it's just so bad. It's good at times, some of this dubbing. So anyway, the basic plot of this film is you have Mr. Tako, who is the head of Pacific Pharmaceuticals, played by Ichirō Arishima. He's frustrated with the television shows his company is sponsoring and wants something to boost his ratings. Now, if I remember correctly from what I've heard, the Japanese version is more of a satire, and the American version is trying to be more serious. So in the beginning, you have this really corny, crappy-looking shot of, like, Earth and stuff like that. And then you have this really pretentious dialogue interspersed over it for some reason. So you have this narrator quoting Shakespeare for some reason, and this is all done really seriously, and it's quite laughable. But I guess in the Japanese version, this was footage from the failed television show that's not working, that isn't good, and spent all this money on it, and it sucks. So it makes more sense within context of the Japanese version, it sounds like, than it does here in the American version, where it just opens up and you're just like, Shakespeare quotes? What the fuck? Why are we... What does this have to do with anything? So, when a doctor tells Tako about a giant monster he discovered on the small Faroe Island, Tako believes that it would be a brilliant idea to use the monster to gain publicity. Tako immediately sends two men, Sakurai and Kensaburo, played by Yu Fukuji and Kenji Sahara, to find and bring back the monster. Meanwhile, the American submarine Seahawk gets caught in an iceberg. The iceberg collapses, unleashing Godzilla, who in the Japanese version had been trapped within since 1955, who then destroys the submarine in a nearby military base. Now, this happens like 20 minutes into the movie, and we don't really get Kong, I think, until like 30 or 40 minutes or something. So yeah, one of the things I definitely thought this film really didn't quite land was its pacing. It's a fairly slow-paced movie, at least the American version that I saw. You had little shots of Godzilla, and then Kong didn't really do anything until 40 minutes in the movie. And then it just felt like there was more lines of dialogue and talking in the scenes with the UN and the scenes with the fucking so-called wannabe expert who's blabbing about pseudoscientific bullshit. And I also remember him I don't know if this is how you pronounce. I don't think you pronounce this word this way. I just remember him pronouncing reptile wrong. He's all like reptiles. Godzilla is a reptile, and reptiles, I'm like, what the fuck is a reptile? I think you mean reptile. This is the only movie I've ever seen where somebody's pronouncing a reptile. He was just trying to sound more sophisticated or some shit, I guess. It was these reptiles. But anyway. So yeah, there's not a lot that happens until this stuff really, stuff really starts to get interesting. And when stuff starts to get interesting, it's when you are on Faroe Island and King Kong arrives and he fights this octopus that shows up and attacks the native village there. And what I really liked is they had a mix of a real octopus and a stop motion octopus, and it was really inventive. It was really crazy to see a real octopus put on a miniature set, wreaking havoc and stuff like that. And so, and also on this scene of Faroe Island, there's some really cringy, just really bad attempts at humor, where you have this just repeated joke of corns. Because the two Asian guys who went there were sent by Tako to go investigate. The whole the comic relief is this one guy. He's all like, "Oh, my corns are killing me." And then the other guy's like, "Oh, make sure when you see the monster, tell him about your corns." And I'm just thinking, like, I'm laughing about how absurd it is, but then I'm also dying inside because I'm like, really? This is your comedy? This is your comic relief here? Corn jokes? And then it just continues. You think it won't? You think it's over, and then the next scene they're just dragging this joke out way too long, and it ends with this really dumb line where King Kong shows up, and then the guys are like, "See, my corns are never wrong." I'm just like, oh god, yes they are. They're dead wrong. They're wrong because this is all wrong. This is just not funny. This is just terrible and embarrassing. I feel like Taco in that one scene when Godzilla first shows up and he's attacking Japan again, and he's all. I love this scene because he's all like, he all is freaking out about Godzilla on TV. He's like, oh no, I'm sick of Godzilla. No more Godzilla. Oh, I love it. That one cracked me up. So, anyway, so King Kong, he fights the octopus, he defeats the octopus, then he drinks some red berry juice from this berry, which pretty much acts as a narcoleptic, and it puts him to sleep. The pharmaceutical guy also wants them to get this berry because it has some mysterious properties, magical properties that they could use. And so Sakurai and Shinsaburo place Kong on a large raft and begin to transport him back to Japan. Mr. Taco arrives on the ship transporting Kong, but a JSDF ship stops them and orders them to return Kong to Faro Island. Meanwhile, Godzilla arrives in Japan and begins terrorizing the countryside. Kong wakes up and breaks free from the rafts. Reaching the mainland, Kong engages Godzilla in a brief, really lame, crappy battle that just ends in Kong getting hit once by Godzilla's fire breath and just retreating like a total pussy. Oh, King Kong? More like King Pussy. So he retreats, and because Godzilla nearly burns him alive. Well, it doesn't really look like that. This is just Wikipedia's explanation for things that happen. It doesn't really look like that. Kong just gets, like, fire breath in the titty and then leaves. It was really disappointing. So the JSDF then digs a large pit, which they then fill with explosives and fill it with gasoline, lure Godzilla into it, but of course it doesn't do shit. They then string up a barrier power lines around the city filled with 1 million volts of electricity. 50,000 volts were tried in the first movie, but it didn't work. So they're trying to use 1 million volts. And it proves effective against Godzilla, but then Kong just shows up and just breaks out Godzilla. He just eats the power lines and feeds off the electricity, which apparently makes him stronger. Which ties into what the original concept for this film was, which Willis O'Brien, who did a lot of the stop motion work for King Kong, the 1933 film, he wanted to make a film in the 60s where Kong would face off against a giant Frankenstein monster. And he was going to call it King Kong versus Prometheus, or King Kong versus Frankenstein. King Kong meets Frankenstein. The idea was then changed around because of other instances, and then this film was made. King Kong versus Godzilla. And honestly, I would have rather seen that. Because, yeah, it's kind of fun to see King Kong fight Godzilla, but this isn't really King Kong. I mean, and also King Kong really isn't even a fair match. It's not a fair fight. King Kong's not a good adversary for Godzilla. He really isn't. So, it would have been more believable of a bout if it was Kong versus a giant Frankenstein monster. And speaking of that, there actually was a Japanese film, I think, that had a giant Frankenstein monster in it. I think it was like one of those Baragon movies or something. I'm trying to remember what it was called. And I saw it, and it was pretty bad, but I do remember seeing that movie. But anyway, so Kong shows up, bails Godzilla out of this jam because he just conveniently shows up and feeds off the electricity. Kong then arrives in Tokyo, starts wrecking shit, captures Fumiko Sakurai's sister. The JSDF launches capsules full of the Faroe Island berry juice to put Kong to sleep, and then they play the drums because that apparently reminds him of the natives who were playing the drums on Faroe Island, and he passes out like a college kid after a day, like a 2-day bender. So then the JSDF decides to transport Kong via balloons. Fucking balloons! So they're taking balloon. It's such a absurd sight, to be honest, to see Kong strung up on these like yellow balloons and being carried away. It's such a strange sight that my voice cracked. It was just like even my own voice couldn't believe it. It's like King Kong on balloons? Are you kidding me? So these balloons must be really strong. So he floats away in these balloons, and they're transporting him on these balloons because they want to transport him to Godzilla, so in hopes that they will kill each other. So the next morning, Kong is then dropped via balloons to the summit of Mount Fuji, and the two then engage in a battle. It's the main event of Kaiju Mania, and it's fun. Admittedly, it is really fun to see King Kong fight against Godzilla, but it's not a very memorable fight. King Kong throws some rocks at Godzilla, doesn't do shit. Godzilla pretty much is kicking his ass the majority of the fight, and it isn't until he gets struck by lightning conveniently that he starts fighting back. And even then it isn't much, because there's a scene where King Kong does a somersault, like he's trying to show how athletic and how badass he is, and he then just slams his head into a rock. I'm like, wow, that is an epic fail. That is a gigantic Titanic-sized fail right there. Kong's like, anything you can do, I can do better. Ooh, whoops. And the fight ends with Kong tackling Godzilla, and they fall into the water. An earthquake all of a sudden just happens out of nowhere, and Kong, I guess, won, because he shows up out of the water and swims away, and then the UN guy is talking about how Kong's going to swim back to his homeland, and Godzilla is defeated, and that's it. And I'm like, I don't even buy it, because Godzilla's kicking his ass for the majority of the fight. This really doesn't make any sense how Kong would win. And especially in a Japanese, and apparently there is no version where Godzilla wins. For the longest time, I thought Godzilla won, or there was like alternate cuts of the film where Godzilla wins and one where Kong wins. But no, there's only one cut of the film, one ending. I mean, there's two different cuts. There's the Japanese version and the American version, but in both versions, it's the same ending. Kong wins. And it's just like, how? Why? Godzilla's faced off monsters previously, from what I've read, and from what I've seen later with some of the monsters that Godzilla's faced off against that are stronger and definitely more of a match for Godzilla than Kong. And there's some giant gorilla, and just because he eats electricity and it makes him stronger, he defeats Godzilla. I don't buy it. I really don't. But yeah, I mean that's King Kong versus Godzilla. There's really not that much to it. The battles, it would have been nice to have more battles between the two, and have each one of them do a little bit more. I mean, Godzilla gets in more shots than Kong does. I mean, he hits him with his tail, he shoots him with his fire breath, he's throwing rock, he's burying Kong, he trips him with his tail. It would have been nice to see them fight earlier, like a little tussle earlier, like a little brief one. I mean, you did have a brief one, but it wasn't really a battle. King Kong showed up and Godzilla hit him with fire breath, and then he just ran off like a total bitch. That's all that really happened there. The ending battle, it was, there's some fun to be had, some nice monster bashing fun, but it left me wanting more. Like, I felt like there should have been more to it. So I definitely do feel that there's room for improvement with King Kong versus Godzilla. I mean, the new film, yeah, I think it definitely have a battle for the ages, one that is more worthy of the title and the tout. And this is a highly touted battle, and it just ends in just like, it's just really not. It's over what seems like a little bit too quickly, and the ending is unsatisfying. It's like if you had a main event of WrestleMania and it ended in like a count out. It's just disappointing, and you're just like, damn, this sucked. It kind of sucked. Can I have my money back? But I still had some fun with the movie as a time waster. I've seen worse. But I wouldn't say like I'm a huge fan of the film. I personally think it lacked any human characters that I gave a flying fuck about, and I really think it would have helped the movie if it had some likable characters, human characters that actually cared about what will happen to them. There's no one like that in this movie. And I just wanted more of King Kong and Godzilla, more of them doing things, because it just felt like there was more talking and stuff with the UN and stuff with the wannabe scientist guy explaining shit that didn't need to be explained, and the comic relief bits, and it was just, yeah, it was do I really like this movie? I mean, because I'm just like, I'm thinking about it, I'm like, I don't really want to watch this movie again. Is this really a time waster? Fuck that. No, it's not really a time waster. I mean, this is one of those reviews where the more I think about it, the more I'm like, no. Honestly, I wasn't a super big fan of this movie. I had some fun with it. I've seen worse, but I would say it's a notch below average the more I think about it, because you have King Kong and Godzilla. They're in a movie together. They don't do a lot until the 50-minute mark, and the first time they meet, they don't do much. The battle that they have is fairly disappointing, but there are some fun stuff. I mean, Godzilla fighting the army and stuff, and it's always enjoyable to me to see Godzilla, going around and stomping on things and delivering his signature roar. So, I mean, there's always some fun to be had, but it's just, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's just the American version. Maybe that's what it is. I mean, the comedy didn't work. It was too serious at times. It made it boring. And then the finale was a letdown. So, yeah, I don't know what else to say about King Kong versus Godzilla. This probably isn't much of a review, and I apologize. There's not much to say. It really isn't. It's just not much of a plot. It's just Godzilla shows up. He breaks out because these submarine captain's a dumbass and smashes into an iceberg. Breaks out Godzilla. Godzilla goes back to Japan. The Japanese freak out. They're like, oh, no more Godzilla. I'm sick of Godzilla. And so they want somebody to fight Godzilla and get rid of him once and for all, and they end up getting Kong, and they try to use him to do it. And the whole stuff with Kong, they got him because of some advertising scheme. And that's really it. That's the plot. That's all it is. So, I mean, it has its fans, and that's cool, that's fine. I'm not one of them. Hopefully the Japanese version, whenever I do see that again, or see that for the first time, not again. Whenever I do see that, hopefully that'll be a more enjoyable experience, because this American version just really wasn't that great, to be honest. Was it a total piece of shit? I've seen worse, but it still wasn't that great. Anyway, I don't know what to say about the film, except I was rated out of 5 stars. I would give the movie 2.5 out of 5. Like I said, it's just a notch below average. But anyway, thank you for watching my review of King Kong versus Godzilla, and I will see you guys later. See ya.